Welcome, one and all, to Transitional Being, Science and Self-Esteem. I left a pause there as a deliberate little experiment. Hands up how many people were starting to feel a little uncomfortable during that silence. Okay, that's interesting. See, Eckhart Tolle coined the phrase, get to the future, get to the future, to describe people's dissatisfaction with the present moment. Because so often we're resisting the present moment because we're trying to get to the next moment or moments far in the future. This is understandable considering that we're taught that happiness and well-being only comes in the future or when we buy stuff. Either way, you're not taught that you can choose to be happy right now. This talk is actually the third in the series. I've actually noticed a tendency in me since advocating TZM of doing things in trilogies, so cheers Peter Joseph. So, in transitional thinking I covered different facets of cultural beliefs and values, and in transitional doing I cover ideas for solution sets that can actually be applied, and you can find both of those on YouTube. And now with this talk I'm going to explore a relationship between the scientific method and self-esteem and how they feed into each other with their similar functions, and how building self-esteem is crucial to becoming the change we want to see in the world. Now it's all well and good saying become the change, but how is that achieved? How do we shift our values to create and maintain a sustainable, emergent and compassionate society like a natural law resource-based economy? Now this is also where a scientific worldview becomes useful, where it can be actually advantageous to creating self-esteem. When you engage the effort of self-improvement, you need to use effective practices, even if it's just to know that you're going in the direction of true self-generated well-being and not just ego construction. And the scientific method can be applied here, despite the fact that some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about are more intuitive than logical. The idea of adopting the behaviour and mindsets of a successful person when you are not one of those people to begin with is inherently irrational, but it works to improve oneself if a sustained effort is put in. To become better people, we need to care about what is demonstrably true and adjusting our beliefs in accordance with the evidence of reality. To do that, we need to be objective and mature enough to not allow our emotions to cloud the issue. So what exactly is self-esteem? In his book, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, Nathaniel Branden describes it as confidence in our ability to think, confidence in our ability to cope with the basic challenges of life, and confidence in our right to be successful and happy. So why self-esteem? Or at least why an active striving for it? And why is it instrumental to effective activism? Consider what kind of world we advocate. Think about the kinds of social values that such a world needs to be driven by. Think about how different that is to how we are generally conditioned to think and value in this system. Even for seasoned activists, this can be a real challenge to live up to all the time. Since we all came out of this distorted culture, we're all byproducts of it to a certain degree. This is also why the transition is necessary to enable the creation of a socio-economic paradigm that reinforces and respects well-being. Otherwise, you're just soaking the population in nasty ideology, making them breathe it in and exhale it back out again anytime they go to work or any other economic activity. This ensures that we will be consistently tainted, and so the transition away will start getting us off this ideological poison and ease people into better ways of being. So that's why I called this transitional being, because self-esteem isn't just something that you practice and do, it's something that you are, something you've internalized. The general mindset of a person in what we like to envision for an NLRBE is someone who isn't held back by inner conflict, someone who is driven yet enjoys as much of their lives as possible, someone whom being loving and reasonable in a good measure and balance is second nature. We are advocating for a society characterized by healthy self-esteem, So when you're advocating an alternative value system and socioeconomic approach, it helps to have done the work to internalize as much of that as possible in order for you to communicate it congruently and more effectively. Now, it's easy to just want the end result straight away. If I told you that you could feel instantly happy without doing anything remotely difficult, even if you were depressed as hell, chances are you'd more than likely go for it. Because that way it minimizes time and effort while maximizing on the benefit. This is an understandable part of our psychology because it can be damn efficient when it comes to mechanical tasks and basic survival. But when it comes to tasks that require abstract thought and self-conceptualization, this efficiency mechanism turns into a magic pill mentality, where concerted effort is dispensed with in favor of quick fixes. So we need to understand that the process by which we build our self-esteem is both more important and equally as important as the end result. And even if you could get the end result straight away, you wouldn't appreciate it, because it's the accomplishment of the process which makes the end result awesome. We also need to keep in mind that as human beings living in 2016, it's highly debatable whether we will be alive long enough to see the full fruition of an NLRBE. So even if we won't see the end result, at least we took right action while we were alive, so those that come after us have an easier job of moving things along. We can focus all we like on those end results. But a destination doesn't come to you. You get to the destination by getting moving. And you do that by taking right action. If there's anything I want you to take away with you this afternoon about how to actually get started in changing this world, it's this. Identify what right action is necessary for you to take to achieve the outcome and/or to solve the problem, and just get on with it. With that information, you know what right action is required. Now, I know what you're thinking. There is that initial resistance to the idea of just taking right action, because when we realize this, we encounter the psychological phenomenon of impulse control. And our brains actually become an expert in creating excuses not to act. And after a while, we build up too many excuses and we end up not taking right action. In this regard, I would strongly recommend a book by Brian Tracy. It's called No Excuses. So taking right action is the initial spark that gets you going. In reference to the scientific method, this will be your testing or experiments. Thinking about taking right action in this context also makes it easier, because as the person conducting the experiment, can you fail? You'll be surprised at the sheer difference between your state of mind when you're being inactive and when you're being active. When you're inactive, you'll mostly feel like nothing like shallow stimulus will improve your mood. But the very act of taking right action is one of the best antidepressants that I've discovered. Because when you take right action, you're assuming control of your life and its trajectory. You cease to be hopelessly blown around like a leaf on the wind, because you've taken the wheel and started steering. Now, when you take right action, when you expose yourself to situations which venture outside your comfort zone, you'll gather data that I will call reference experience. This means a series of experiences which gives you a reference to how things unfold, what actions are helpful, what actions hinder your progress, what other people's reactions are, not just to the information itself, but also your communication of that information. You gather this feedback data and it tells you where you're going right, where you're going wrong, and how to fix your approach. And only through repetition of testing these references do you grow and learn. There's a self-development phrase that I really hold on to now. It's actually on behalf of Hubi, a former RSD instructor. He says, "Every failure is a brick in my palace." This means that in order to succeed, you have to have failed and learnt from those failures. No one is going to come right out the gate with a perfect way of doing things. There's a scene in Battlestar Galactica where one of the characters is talking about the Cylon resurrection cycle. See, whenever a Cylon dies, a new dormant model of that same production line is activated, and all prior models of every other model is downloaded into it. The word she uses is death becomes a learning experience. Now, if you think figuratively about death or failure in this sense, coupled with accumulating and interpreting references, your fear of failure will begin to be slowly replaced with anticipation of learning a new lesson. There's a natural tendency to avoid failing at all, but unless you've failed, you won't properly know how to succeed. One more point about this is that important references are also gained from moments where you choose not to take right action, or you recognize that you've missed the opportunity altogether. The knowledge of not taking right action when you could is something that we can often beat ourselves up about. However, when we use those references as emotional leverage, we can actually push ourselves into taking right action, because you actually find that the pain of taking right action is far less severe than the pain of not taking right action. We humans naturally move to avoid pain, so it becomes a natural progression towards ease and effectiveness. Now that you're taking right action and acquiring references, you'll start to find it becomes a little easier. You don't have to keep exerting as much effort as you did before. This is because you've pushed through the initial resistance and you're expanding your comfort zone. It's like giving a car a push start. The object that you're about to move is at rest, and you have to push with enough force to transfer the kinetic energy over onto it to get it moving. In the scientific community, this is called activation energy. Once the car is actually moving, it becomes a matter of adding to the momentum until the engine fires up. Now, once you have momentum, it's easy to lose it. And it's lost just like the momentum of the car would be lost when you take the foot off the gas. This can result in a fuzziness or fog, where you can start to settle in again and value comfort over growth. And that's where complacency can set in. This is also understandable to a certain degree, since there will be natural plateaus of efficiency along your journey where you won't have to push as hard, and you need to recognize where that actually starts getting harmful. Kind of like a race car driver that has popped into the pit lane. He wants to only spend as much time in that pit lane and not a second more, because every second that he is in maintenance is a second of growth and momentum lost. This is solved by sharpening your focus. If you ever find yourself devoting more time towards unproductive tasks, you're actually in a position where you're more likely to have your thoughts clouded and pulled in different directions, and so you end up not going anywhere. So you need to stop yourself and ask yourself whether what you're doing is making progress towards your goals. If not, then you need to remind yourself, center yourself, and remind yourself of what actions are necessary and feasible, and then just get on with it. You'll get the hang of it once you persevere, because, as I said, you'll soon gain a momentum. Now, are you reactive to life, or are you responsive to life? It kind of seems like they're the same thing on the face of it. However, the difference between the two is that a reaction is where we impose our own feelings and beliefs before considering what the other person is actually saying, if at all. And a response is where you take on board what is being communicated, and then the response is considered and relevant. Drawing a scientific parallel, this would be the manner in which you receive all the data that you can from your tests, and not just focus on the data that confirms any existing bias, and actually proper reporting of your findings with others who will or already are replicating your tests. You may not actually personally like what you're presented with in your findings, but the scientific method requires accurate reporting of those findings, if accurate and explanatory models are at all possible. In his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Dr. Stephen Covey describes the practice of seek first to understand, then be understood. This is very important, especially if we're conversing with people about a socioeconomic system so foreign to most of them that they will actually have inapplicable frames of reference, and it can be easy to just get stuck in a debunking cycle with them without actually explaining what the NLRBE is. When you seek first to understand, then be understood, not only are you respecting their freedom to express their point of view, whatever that may be, but you've also gathered the information that you need about their frame of reference to make your explanations to them as relevant to them as possible. You custom make your presentation on the fly just for them because it speaks directly to them. Care about finding out what their gripes are, what they value in life, what kind of life they want for their children, if they have any. This way, our response is measured, non-reactive, relevant, and overall compassionate, because you cared enough about their question to provide the best answer from where you are to where they are. Now, most of you will be already familiar with the terms scarcity and abundance in our materials in terms of availability of resources. However, how often do we think about this dichotomy in terms of the kind of mentality we have? Scarcity thinking is characterized by pessimism, anxiety and stress, depression, low self-esteem and low personal achievement, whereas abundance thinking is characterized by confidence, self-assertiveness, liberty, compassion, high self-esteem and high personal achievement. As human beings whose states of mind are never fixed for long, there will be a natural fluctuation along the scale between scarcity and abundance in our general day-to-day living. Every now and then, have a little look at yourself and notice where on the scale you find your mind wandering. People of high self-esteem have more consistency in their abundance thinking and vice versa. This is because states of mind will reinforce and perpetuate themselves in cycles or spirals, because scarcity is a downward spiral, whereas abundance is an upward spiral. Okay, this is where it gets a little complex for just a moment. This is what I like to call positive congruence, meaning that your thoughts, emotions and actions are in alignment with a positive value system. Firstly, the idea of congruence is very helpful in communication. When you are incongruent, it means that there is a conflict in one or more of these factors. For instance, if you talk about non-violent communication, and you're actually using what Marshall Rosenberg called jackal language, meaning that you're judging, attacking, demeaning, etc., your incongruence will show because the content of what you're speaking about does not match with how you're communicating it. Now, the Venn diagram on the left shows normal psychological congruence, where your thoughts, emotions, and actions are in alignment. There's a word that we use to describe people who display consistent congruence. We call them authentic. This is because there is no discrepancy between these factors. They say exactly what they think and feel, and vice versa. Now, the diagram on the right is what applies to us more as activists. It shows the present value set, meaning all the beliefs, knowledge, convictions and so forth that makes up you, and the future value set, meaning all the social and methodological values that we advocate for an NLRBE. People need to see congruence in you if they are to take you seriously when you talk to them about this. Now, don't get me wrong, people will actually look for incongruence in you, either by observing your general way of being, but mostly through conversation. They do this because they want to know whether this new idea you're talking to them about is what it appears to be. And if they see that you're congruent to what you're saying, they're more likely to listen. Now, the practice of nonviolent communication, as I referred to earlier, it's a conflict resolution practice centered around the recognition of the unhealthy ways that we express unmet needs, and move instead to diffuse by observing the evidence of their need, speaking to it, identifying your own need, and then formulating a positive request for resolution. So often we resort to using verbal violence in the form of judgments and attacks as a desperate and tragic attempt at expressing a need that isn't met. So often we can sometimes only focus on how good it would make us feel to get one over on that other person, not thinking about the kind of unnecessary shame that might cause them. Have you ever been in an online debate and thought that maybe you could shock or shame them into rejecting their current view in favour of your own one because you show how ridiculous their own view is? Yeah, how well did that turn out for you? This is why NVC is designed to unify and not separate. And with the dominant economic practice in this current system breeding competition and mistrust, the need for this is ever more evident and important. Now, the issue of entitlement is a powerful but hardly recognised factor in the issue of social change. Speaking scientifically, entitlement could be the models your data has informed, the theories, because your sense of entitlement will fluctuate in accordance with your understanding of where you are. But you're hopefully always working towards healthier entitlement, like you would be working towards a model of reality that matches actual reality as closely as possible. Often when talking to people about the idea of a better socioeconomic paradigm beyond the current one, and especially when revealing the current system's inherent unsustainability, we can encounter such mindsets that sometimes borders on pathological cynicism. People utterly convinced of the ultimate hopelessness of humanity to improve the world, because at least then they wouldn't have to deal with the necessary changes. It's a bit like Hugh Laurie's character in the film Tomorrowland, when he said, in every moment there's a possibility of a better future, but you people won't believe it. And because you won't believe it, you won't do what is necessary to make it a reality. So you dwell on this terrible future, you resign yourselves to it for one reason, because that future doesn't ask anything of you today. And this is an example of what I like to call a glass ceiling, a self-imposed limit on how high you will go. Now this is, again, understandable considering we live in a system that is forever trying to impose limits on our volitional choices. And on many levels it punishes us for having ideas above our station, as it were. So naturally, we as human beings can be rife with all sorts of limitations that we simply refuse to push beyond. Now, with regards to our activism, we discover in others a lack of entitlement to change the world and a lack of entitlement to a high standard of living, because the status quo becomes accepted and any complaint regarding social problems is discouraged, then if necessary demonized, then if necessary criminalized. This cycle must be broken if we expect to achieve any of our goals. We need to move from this sense of unhealthy entitlement to this sense of healthy entitlement. Earning a sense of entitlement to change the world for the better is easy. You just got to start doing it. Reference experiences of engaging in activities beyond your comfort zone, playing it smart and coming back unscathed creates entitlement to perform said activity without needing permission from the society, because you're doing it mainly for the society. Now, considering the fact that we can all be mistaken about all sorts of things from time to time, it's always a good idea to allow what we think we know to be updated with corrections if necessary. This is something we talk about already with the scientific method always being open to having its findings challenged. How often do we think that this can be applied to ourselves as people? At this point, most of us recognize, at least at some point, another glass ceiling: the emotional resistance to admitting faults in ourselves. So often we perceive this as a failure or as an insult, and thus work quickly to avoid such pain. How can we actually know what to fix if we don't listen to the evidence of that fault. We must remember, we don't have to be winning, we just at least have to be playing. Now, endo-states. I hope everyone's bearing with the jargon, by the way. So yeah, endo-state, or joy from the inside, literally. Something seemingly so elusive, isn't it? Sure, it has to be to maintain the status quo. We get taught that true happiness doesn't come from within, but instead it comes from external circumstances and stimulus. Things that you have and things that happen to you make you happy, right? Like you get that pay rise at work and you feel really happy because of it. What would it take to feel like that just by being you? Just sat there in your chair and feeling as happy in yourself as something really good happened in your life. In his book, The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle tells the parable of a beggar who's been sleeping on a box for decades. And he gets approached one day by a stranger and asks whether he's ever looked inside the box. And the beggar just shrugs like, nah, it's empty, there's nothing in there. But the beggar encourages him a little more. So the beggar manages to get the box open, and he finds that the box is filled with gold. See, the lesson in that parable is that you already had the value inside you all along. You just need to be willing to look inside. One of the lessons that we can actually learn from toddlers is the sheer degree of joy they take in living. They haven't yet learned of all the stresses and neuroses that await them in adulthood. When they're happy, you can see that that's their whole world. It's like, what would you have to do or have done to you that would make you that happy? You don't see toddlers with anxiety disorders and taking up your time complaining about their lot. You see, the thing is, they become like that later on in life because we can't actually encourage endo-state and also have permanently unsatisfied consumers in this society. So we systematically train that happiness out of them, only for us to have to relearn it again to be truly happy later on in life. And speaking of the value that you build within yourself, what naturally comes from this is the will to share that value with the world. If you consider yourself a person of value in some way, doesn't that feel good to share it with others? This is actually what is meant by the old saying, it's better to give. Because those that offer value in some way are more likely to be appreciated and more worthy members of society than those who leech value from others due to an inner value deficiency. People all too often become black holes of good emotions. They take because they don't have anything to give. Working to become a wellspring of well-being leads to the will to share it with the world. And in a lot of ways, this is the first step before your first step, as it were. In order for an activist's work to inspire a loving mentality, it needs to come from a good place in terms with how at ease we are with ourselves. Nathaniel Branden in the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem calls this the practice of self-acceptance. When you're able to accept and love yourself fully, without denial of what kind of person you are, and move on to fix what you can fix, and what you can't fix, you feature. There's an internet joke which tries to mock Kanye West for his practice of self-acceptance. You know, the one that says, nobody loves Kanye the way Kanye loves Kanye? That's actually what I'm talking about. That unshakable self-love. A self-loving attitude needs to come from a mind that is already secure in itself to not be needy or self-sabotage. A mind that hasn't come to terms with itself is still in the process of having to fix that first. This is why an abundance mentality is so important. Because then, whatever you do is coming from a positive paradigm that you've created and are radiating. And I'll conclude this talk with a quote from the late psychiatrist Morgan Scott Peck. Until you value yourself, you won't value your time. Until you value your time, you won't do anything with it.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Brilliant.